Velikiye Luki. To someone looking at a regular map, it was just a tiny dot lost in the icy vastness of Russia. A small town surrounded by dense forests, frozen rivers, and miles of snow where the wind howled like a hungry wolf. But for the generals who commanded World War II, that tiny dot shone like gold. Velikiye Luki was a key hidden in the pocket of war. There, precious tracks intersected, railway lines that cut through the north and center of the Soviet Union like arteries carrying blood. To a giant body, trains carrying ammunition, fuel, food, reinforcements and orders passed along those tracks. In times of peace, it was just another ordinary station. In times of war, it was life or death. The Germans and Soviets knew this. Whoever controlled Velikiye Luki decided where the blood of war flowed. If the Germans held it, they could feed their army, strengthen lines further north, and continue pushing the front like a knife, cutting into the frozen flesh of Russia. But if the Soviets were to take the city, they would cut off communication and slowly suffocate the invaders like a crease tightening around an enemy's neck. That was why, even though it was small, Velikiye Luki received the silent title of strength. Its simple blocks, wooden houses and narrow streets concealed immense strategic value, and everyone knew that very soon it would cease to be a peaceful point on the map and would become a stage for horror and bravery. There, in that place ignored by almost the entire world, hundreds of thousands of lives would be decided, and a small Russian town covered in snow would find its name forever written in history, not as a village, but as a battlefield. The year was 1942, and winter seemed determined to swallow the world. Nazi Germany was still advancing on many fronts, but for the first time since the start of the invasion, something had changed: the wind. And it wasn't just the freezing wind that cut his face like blades of ice. The wind of war. In the heart of the Soviet Union, far away, the city of Stalingrad burned in a hell of broken bricks, smoke, and corpses piled up in the streets. The Wehrmacht, which had once marched confidently like an unbeatable war machine, was now slowly bleeding. Veteran soldiers fell like dry leaves. Tanks were on fire. Generals were beginning to feel the bitter taste of doubt. The whole world seemed to watch the German colossus stumble. Hitler, sitting in his bunker, refused to admit any sign of weakness. In his mind, retreating was forbidden. Losing territory was as shameful as a complete defeat. He shouted orders that echoed through the radios. Hold on to every meter, every city. Don't take a single step back. And so the decision fell upon Velikiye Luki like a death sentence. Even though it was small, even though it was isolated in that endless white sea of snow, it would be defended at all costs. For the German High Command, losing Velikiye Luki meant opening a crack in a dike about to burst. Supply routes could be cut off, reinforcements stranded along the way, and the entire front, from North Leningrad to Smolensk, was at risk of collapsing. So while the cold froze rivers, roads, and even the breath in our lungs, orders and reinforcements began to arrive to transform the city into an improvised fortress. Officers pushed exhausted soldiers into hastily dug trenches. Houses were occupied and turned into firing ranges. Barbed wire emerged like nerves of steel stretching across city blocks. The Germans didn't know it yet, but they were digging their own frozen grave, because while they were trying to hold their ground on that tiny spot on the map, the Red Army was preparing to attack not with footsteps, but with a siege that would come like a storm of snow and steel. In the Russian winter, there would be no mercy, and from that point on, every order to not retreat would only mean more blood dripping onto the white snow. When December finally fell like an axe on the front, Velikiye Luki was no longer an ordinary city. It was a military island surrounded by seas of snow. The Wehrmacht placed approximately 7,000 men. Many of them were hardened veterans of the campaign in the east, but also frightened young men, newly arrived from the German countryside, trembling not only from the cold, but from the fear of facing the Red Army. The garrison was pushed inside the city limits with an impossible mission: hold the position until the end. It didn't matter if a single soldier survived. The order was clear and cruel. No one would leave until the High Command allowed it, and that day might never come. Velikiye Luki has turned into a military labyrinth. Every abandoned building became a barracks, every basement a shelter, every attic a watchtower. German artillery was positioned to cover the frozen train tracks and roads like the teeth of a cornered beast ready to bite anyone who approached. The officers distributed maps, ammunition, and fiery speeches. They told the soldiers that they were the final barrier before the total collapse of the front. They believed it because they had no choice. But there was a bigger problem. Silent, almost invisible, Velikiye Luki was far from everything. The nearest German units were dozens of kilometers away, struggling to survive in their own pockets of snow and frozen mud. Telephone lines were cut daily by Soviet patrols. Trains, when they tried to get close, simply disappeared, destroyed by mines, saboteurs, or bombings. Within the city, every man knew something that no commander would admit aloud. The garrison was isolated. No guaranteed supplies, no escape route, no guarantee of assistance. And worse, the Soviets knew this too. The German soldiers retreated inside the occupied houses, wrapped in thick blankets, trying to share cigarettes and stories to forget the terror that surrounded them. Outside, the wind blew like an omen, stirring up snow in swirls that looked like marching ghosts. At that moment, even before the first shot of the siege was fired, Velikiye Luki was already a dead city waiting to fall. They were a handful of men abandoned in the white vastness, about to face something much bigger than themselves: the crushing weight of the Red Army and the deadly cold of the Russian winter. The dawn that changed everything arrived without warning, hidden behind heavy clouds that darkened the sky as if the day had given up on being born. While German soldiers lit weak stoves and rubbed their frozen hands to ward off numbness, the Red Army moved silently, like predators in the snow. In the forests surrounding the city, thousands of Soviet boots sank into the soft snow, creaking like poorly lubricated iron dolls. Entire divisions marched slowly, pushing cannons, machine guns, and even sleds loaded with ammunition. They were men accustomed to the brutal winter. Peasants, Siberians, ex-prisoners, all hardened by years of war and famine. When the sun finally broke through the grey horizon, Velikiye Luki was no longer alone. The siege had begun. German radio signals began to arrive weaker and weaker, filled with static and despair. Patrols sent to reconnoiter the roads did not return. Soldiers peered through binoculars and glimpsed shadows, rows of Soviet uniforms emerging from the forest. And then came the moment that no one could ignore. The Soviets met both south and north of the city, closing off the escape route like a steel. Dar slamming in the Germans' faces. Velikiye Luki was officially surrounded. The first shots echoed dryly in the icy air. German machine guns spat fire, attempting to repel the approaching red waves. But the Red Army did not retreat. It was like watching tides crashing against a rock. Always more soldiers, more cannons, more shouts in Russian exploding in the wind. The ice turned to mud, mixed with blood, as outer structures began to crumble. German outposts disappeared under the human avalanche. In each confrontation, dozens fell, some buried under the snow, others freezing before bleeding to death. Then, on internal radios, a final message, short and delivered in a tense voice, circulated through each German unit. The city is surrounded. Prepare to defend it to the last man. At that moment, silence fell over the soldiers inside Velikiye Luki. They knew what that meant. There would be no withdrawal. There would be no easy way to get help. The city was a cage, and they were the animals trapped inside. Outside, Soviet troops planted their flags in the snow and tightened the siege even further. It was like a closed fist around the city's throat. And as night fell again, heavy, cold, and red with fire on the horizon, everyone in Velikiye Luki, Germans, Soviets, and civilians, felt the same way. The worst was yet to come. What came next didn't begin with a scream, nor with the sound of soldiers running. It started with a strange silence, a silence so profound that even the toughest men felt their hearts pound in their chests, as if he wanted to flee the city alone. It was dawn when the Red Army pulled the trigger on the apocalypse. Without warning, the sky exploded in light and thunder. Russian heavy artillery, dozens of kilometers around, opened fire simultaneously, as if the entire earth had decided to spit fire at Velikiye Luki. Enormous projectiles, as heavy as iron barrels, flew in arcs over the snow walls, whistling like hungry monsters. And when they fell, the world trembled. Entire city blocks were shaking. Wooden houses, as fragile as matchsticks, were ripped from the ground and turned into bonfires. Windows exploded outwards, roofs twisted, and pieces of brick, ice, and bodies flew mixed together through the air. German soldiers scurried to hastily dug shelters, dirty holes in the frozen ground, propped up with planks and sandbags. Inside these holes, men clung to their weapons while the ground vibrated beneath their feet. Some prayed, others screamed, others just clenched their teeth, trying not to go insane. Outside, it was a living nightmare. Poles swaying like broken bones, train cars exploding like boxes of gunpowder, destroyed horses and trucks scattered like broken toys in the snow. Each explosion kicked up white clouds mixed with black smoke. The snow, once clean and cold, quickly turned red. The smell of gunpowder mingled with that of burnt flesh, burning wood, and spilled diesel fuel. It seemed as if the city itself was dying. This bombardment didn't last minutes, it lasted hours, hammering away relentlessly, as if 1,000 hammers were striking the same anvil. And when the cannons finally fell silent, the silence that followed was not peace. It was the silence of someone who knows everything was just beginning. When the German leaders emerged from the shelters, they saw a city they no longer recognized. Velikiye Luki had shed its skin. It was now a field of ruins, smoke and corpses freezing rapidly on the ground. And as if the bombing were merely the abracadabra that opens a macabre trick, shadows began to move in the snow, advancing through the wreckage. Soviet infantry was right behind them, and she wasn't there to negotiate. When the bombing finally stopped, the air felt too heavy to breathe. The snow fell from the sky in slow flakes, as if the world were trying to cover the horror with a white blanket. But nothing could hide what was coming next. From the clouds of dust and smoke, small dark figures emerged. They were Soviet soldiers, hundreds of them, then thousands, advancing like a raging tide through the broken streets of Velikiye Luki. They shouted orders, threw grenades, and hurled themselves against any position that was still firing. It was there that the most brutal battle a man can face began, to urban warfare house by house, step by step. The Germans, though shaken, reacted fiercely. MG-42 machine guns were mounted in broken windows, spitting out long bursts that tore through the snow and the air. Grenades ricocheted through narrow corridors. Snipers positioned themselves on the broken rooftops, patiently waiting for any silhouette that dared to move. Each street was nothing more than a death corridor. To gain a few meters, the Soviets had to cross destroyed squares where frozen bodies served as obstacles. They ran from cover to cover, from craters opened by bombing to destroyed walls, while bullets sliced through the air around them. There was no organized battlefront. It was a chaotic, noisy, savage fight. Two forces locked in a fight, grappling with each other at the throat, battling like animals trapped in the same cage. Inside the buildings, things were even worse. Soldiers climbed slippery staircases littered with blood and rubble, expecting to find an enemy behind each door. Narrow corridors turned into tunnels of death. A German and a Soviet could be separated by only a cracked wall, hearing each other's breathing. Grenades flew through windows, shattering furniture, doors and bones. Rifles were fired from just inches away. Often there wasn't even time to recharge. And then came the knives, bayonets, rifle butts and desperate punches. The snow outside was dark, heavy and dirty with soot and blood. And flames rose from entire buildings, illuminating the night like torches of morning. Sergeants were shouting orders, and no one knew if the voices came from an ally or an enemy. The city had become a labyrinth, where every corner hid an ambush and every block changed hands several times a day. At the end of that first advance, the Soviets had captured some streets, but not without paying a terrifying price. Hundreds of bodies lying on the ice, freezing with their eyes open, staring at the grey sky. And the Germans, even when cornered, showed something terrible. No matter how isolated or afraid they were, they would fight for every brick of Velikiye Luki. The battle had barely begun, and it was already clear that this city would not be taken easily. Neither side would back down, not even an inch. As the days went by, Velikiye Luki ceased to be a city and transformed into a grotesque fortress made of rubble, fire, and frozen corpses. And there, in the shattered heart of that urban labyrinth, the German garrison made a grim and absolute decision. They would fight to the last man. The soldiers who were still breathing, even those who could barely hold a rifle because of the cold, and fear scattered through the ruins like armed ghosts. Each fallen wall was a shield, every window a machine gun nest. Each cellar was a lair where they awaited the enemy, their fingers frozen on the trigger. There was no more strategic thinking or elaborate plans. It was raw survival. The officers shouted orders in hoarse voices, even knowing that their words no longer built any victory. They only postponed the inevitable. Still, no one backed down. They fought for discipline, for camaraderie, for fear of punishment, and perhaps deep down, because they knew that if they didn't fight, they would die anyway. The Soviets quickly learned that this isolated, dead-end garrison was becoming more dangerous every day. A city block taken in the morning could be lost in the afternoon, recovered at night, and contested again at dawn. It was a macabre dance, danced amidst shards of glass, twisted nails, and bodies freezing side by side. Inside the houses, the fighting was so desperate that soldiers made holes in the interior walls to move between rooms without using the door, a tactic known as rat poking. Thus, a squadron could appear out of nowhere, emerging from the dust like demons expelled from hell, surprising Russians who thought they had already cleared the place. Some Germans, too wounded to move, remained in mortally exposed positions just to keep firing. There were cases of men with broken legs firing rifles propped up on boxes, as if their bodies refused to die, before firing their last bullet. And then came the cold, that invisible monster that killed just as many people as gunshots. Fierce defenders trembled beneath their soiled coats, their lips purple, their fingers stiff. Some lost feeling in their skin and didn't even notice when blood was flowing from the cuts. And even so, they continued fighting. Subject to all the normal rules of war, that siege should have quickly broken German morale. But on the contrary, the siege hardened her. The more impossible the situation became, the fiercer the defense became. It was as if the soldiers believed that every minute they gained was worth the life of a comrade dozens of kilometers away, a sacrifice to delay the Red Army's advance. Fanatics? Maybe, or simply men with no choice, swallowed up by a war they hadn't decided to start. But one thing was clear to everyone on the Soviet side. Velikiye Luki wouldn't fall with gentle pushes. It would be necessary to crush it, brick by brick, soul by soul. While Russians and Germans were killing each other in the broken streets of Velikiye Luki, a greater, more silent, and infinitely cruel enemy attacked relentlessly: the Siberian winter. The cold there wasn't just the weather, it wasn't a low temperature. It was a living, almost malevolent force that crawled through the city, entering through cracks in the destroyed walls, cutting through clothes, biting skin, muscle and bone. Thermometers read 30, 40 degrees during the nights. The air was so cold it burned my chest when I breathed. Soldiers coughed and felt a scratching sensation in their lungs, as if they were swallowing ice needles. The equipment was freezing. Gun oil turned into a thick paste. Springs would jam, triggers would seize, and sometimes the soldier would pull his finger and only hear a dry click. Death leaning against his shoulder, waiting for his next move. And snow, that damn snow never stopped. It would fall onto helmets, get into boots, and turn into red mud when mixed with blood. And when the wind blew, it raised white clouds that completely blinded, obscuring the shapes of the world for minutes and leaving men dizzy and disoriented. The cold killed many before the enemy could. Soldiers were found as rigid as statues, sitting against walls, still holding a rifle they would never fire again. Some simply fell asleep from exhaustion and didn't wake up. Others lost fingers, ears and noses from the icy touch of the necrosis. The wounded suffered in ways no hospital could have imagined. There weren't enough stretchers, and the temperature wasn't high enough to stop the ice from biting. A man struck by shrapnel had only two cruel options: bleed until frozen or watch their blood dry up and harden like crystal, leaving the pain throbbing until their body gives up. Both sides felt the weight of that white sentence. Russians, although accustomed to winter, also suffered. They marched for hours in the deep snow, their clothes stiffened by the ice. Some fell, defeated by the cold, before even seeing the enemy in their sights. But there was a stark difference that changed everything. The Soviet troops could rotate, take turns with the men, bring in reinforcements. But the Germans within the city did not have this cruelly simple option. Each soldier who died was not replaced. Each wounded man meant one less weapon, one weaker trench, one house that could be taken. Thus, while winter tore at faces and froze bones, the balance of battle slowly and tipped meter by meter toward the Soviet side. Velikiye Luki was now a place where the enemy could kill you, but the cold would make that even more certain, and without wasting a single bullet. Outside, beyond the Soviet ring closing in on Velikiye Luki, like the inexorable jaws of a primordial leviathan, the world seemed frozen in a limbo of endless white and elongated shadows. Snow fell in heavy flakes, as if the sky were shedding the ashes of fallen empires, covering roads that once pulsed, with the traffic of daily life now transformed into treacherous trails of ice and frozen mud. It was November 1942, in the heart of the Russian winter, that legendary scourge that had devoured entire armies throughout the centuries, from Charles V of Sweden to the Napoleonic invaders, and now, once again, threatening to engulf the children of Nazi Germany in its merciless vastness. The 8th Panzer Division, once a formidable force that had roared across the plains of Eastern Europe at the height of the Blitzkrieg, was now a tattered shadow of its former glory. Hastily reinforced with makeshift units, patched infantry battalions from decimated regiments, exhausted engineer companies that could barely erect a bridge without trembling with fatigue, and artillery remnants whose cannons creaked like old bones as they were dragged through the snow. This division represented the last gasp of a declining Wehrmacht. Its tanks, the once invincible Panthers and Tigers, were now marked by makeshift repairs, metal plates hastily welded over bullet holes, engines coughing up black oily smoke, and tracks that slid uselessly on the accumulated ice. The men who manned them were a tragic mishmash. Veterans of Stalingrad with blank stares, haunted by memories of burning cities. Teenage recruits plucked from peaceful farms in Bavaria or the hills of the Rhineland, whose uniforms still smelled new, but whose eyes already bore the weight of premature horrors. And hardened officers like General Major Erich Brandenberger, who commanded this desperate operation with a determination bordering on madness, knowing that failure would mean not only the loss of a city, but the collapse of the entire northern front. The counterattack was launched on December 7, 1942, under direct orders from the German High Command, which saw in Velikiye Luki not only a strategic stronghold, a vital railway hub linking Moscow to Riga and controlling the flow of supplies to Army Group North, but a symbol of Teutonic resistance against the Red Tide. Armored columns advanced at dawn when the sun barely rose on the horizon, tinging the snow a bloody pink that seemed an omen of carnage. Engines roared, echoing through the frozen pine forests where branches cracked like broken bones under the weight of the frost. Trucks loaded with ammunition and medical supplies followed behind, their wheels spinning furiously in deep ruts, while foot soldiers marched in formation, their winter coats stiffened by the bone-chilling cold, turning sweat to ice and breath into ghostly clouds. For a fleeting moment, the German onslaught seemed irresistible. The first Soviet outposts were crushed like sandcastles beneath the tide. Russian sentries, frozen in their makeshift trenches, were surprised by the roar of tanks, their Maxim machine guns firing in vain against impenetrable armor. Explosions of shells illuminated the snowy field like macabre fireworks, and the snow rose in white plumes mixed with black, earthen fragments of bodies. A narrow corridor was opened, a strip of land mere kilometers wide, bordered by dense forests and frozen swamps, through which messengers rushed with urgent dispatches, and wounded were evacuated on makeshift stretchers, their groans muffled by the howling wind. Fresh ammunition reached the besieged defenders, and for a brief moment the air inside Velikiye Luki vibrated with whispers of salvation. They broke through! The panzers are here! Hold on, brothers! Hold on! But oh, how fragile hope is in the vastness of the Eastern Front, where the Russian winter is not merely weather, but a merciless ally of the Red Army. The Soviets, under General Ivan Galinin and the Third Shock Army, reacted with a ferocity born of years of invasion and suffering. Additional divisions, the 301st Rifle Division, reinforced by fresh T-34 tanks from the Chelyabinsk factory, those steel monsters with 76mm guns that could pierce German armor like paper, were hastily moved from neighboring positions. They emerged from the forests like vengeful specters, their engines echoing like the thunder of an impending storm. Pak-40 anti-tank guns, buried in the snow like bear traps, spewed fire and molten metal, bursting tracks and setting German tanks ablaze in blazing pyres that illuminated the night with an infernal glow. The battle degenerated into a primal chaos of metal against metal, man against man, where the cold amplified every horror. German tanks bogged down in trenches hidden by the snow, their crews screaming as flames licked the cramped compartments, the smell of burning flesh mingling with spilled oil. Russian soldiers, wrapped in padded coats and fur hats, crawled through the frost, throwing Molotov cocktails that exploded in cascades of liquid fire, turning vehicles into burning tombs. Every German advance was paid for in blood. A kilometer gained cost dozens of lives, frozen bodies falling in the snow like broken dolls, their glazed eyes fixed on the grey sky. Terror settled in their hearts, the fear that the next shot would be the last, the despair of seeing comrades torn apart by shrapnel, the dread of freezing alive in an abandoned trench, fingers blackened by cold gangrene. Inside the besieged city, the defenders, some 7,500 men of the German 83rd Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel von Sass, clung to these distress calls like shipwrecked sailors to floating wreckage. In trenches hastily dug among the ruins of Orthodox churches and wooden houses, they huddled together in tight groups, sharing the meager warmth of makeshift fires, fueled by broken furniture and torn books. The radio crackled with static, interrupted by distant voices. "Panzer vorwärts, we are advancing." But each transmission was punctuated by ominous silences, and soon the messages changed tone. Soviets counterattacking. Heavy losses. Hold position. Their faces, blackened by soot and cold, rose with a mixture of hope and terror. Fingers as rigid as claws gripping Mauser, K-98s or MP-40s, weapons that seemed like extensions of their numb bodies. When the corridor closed in mid-December, it was as if the whole world collapsed on them. Soviet artillery, batteries of Katyushas, those Stalin's organs that howled like banshees as they launched rocket salvos, hammered the city mercilessly, turning buildings into piles of smoldering rubble. The ground trembled with each impact, and the air filled with suffocating dust mixed with snow, creating a fog that obscured vision and choked the lungs. Men ran from shelter to shelter, stumbling over bodies swollen with frost, their cries muffled by the constant roar of explosions. A German sergeant, a veteran of Smolensk, pressed his hands to his ears, murmuring forgotten prayers from his childhood, while fragments of brick rained down like deadly hail, cutting exposed flesh and leaving trails of blood that froze instantly. Despair seeped in like the cold, penetrating layers of clothing and soul. Soldiers wrote final letters on scraps of torn paper, trembling words of love and regret. "Dearest mother, forgive me for not returning. Winter has swallowed us." Others, driven mad by hunger, rations reduced to crumbs of stale bread and melted snow soup, hallucinated visions of Christmas celebrations at home, only to be ripped back to reality by a bombing raid that crumbled the roof beneath them. The terror was palpable, the dread of being buried alive under rubble, of being captured and facing Soviet fury for past war crimes, of dying alone in a dark basement, with hungry rats gnawing at the edges of sanity. On the Soviet side, the suffering was a distorted mirror, but no less atrocious. The Red Army riflemen, many of them Ukrainian or Siberian peasants hardened by the Great Famine of 1932-33 and the Stalinist purge, advanced with a determination born of deep hatred. They remembered the villages burned during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the mass executions at Babi Yar, the families lost to the Nazi invasion. Every foot of snow trodden was revenge, T-34 tanks skidding over frozen German bodies, bayonets embedded in grey uniforms with grunts of primal fury. But the cold claimed them too. Fingers amputated by frost, lungs burned by the Arctic air, minds haunted by the spectre of the NKVD, which executed deserters without hesitation. The urban fighting that followed transformed Velikiye Luki into a labyrinth of death. Street by street, the Soviets infiltrated using frozen sewers and crumbling attics as assault routes. Germans defended themselves with MG-42 machine guns mounted on shattered windows. The Hitlers saw spitting bullets in infernal bursts that mowed down waves of attackers. Grenades exploded in narrow corridors, scattering entrails and limbs like macabre confetti. A Russian lieutenant, advancing with his company, watched his men fall one by one hit in the chest, gurgling blood on the snow, another with his leg torn off by a mine, screaming until silence claimed him. Terror reigned supreme. The fear of turning a corner and encountering an ambush, of hearing the click of a trap, of seeing the dawn only to face another day of carnage. As January 1943 approached, the city was a living cemetery. Bodies piled like firewood, covered by a layer of snow that preserved them in grotesque poses of agony. The smell of decomposition mingled with that of gunpowder and burnt diesel, a stench that permeated dreams and waking hours. The Germans, reduced to fewer than 2,000 able-bodied fighters, knew the end was near. Hitler's orders to resist to the last man echoed like a curse, but despair consumed them. Suicides with grenades strapped to their chests, surrenders whispered in the darkness, visions of a Reich that had abandoned them. The Soviets, exhausted but inexorable, tightened the siege, their victory hymns muffled by the wind, while the snow continued to fall, burying the horrors in a white blanket that nothing could cleanse. In the end, Velikiye Luki fell on January 16, 1943, with the surrender of the remaining German forces, a handful of broken, starving and frozen ghosts. But the legacy was one of pure terror, a lesson that on the Eastern Front, hope was a cruel illusion, winter a silent killer, and wore a vortex of despair that devoured souls indiscriminately. The survivors on both sides would forever carry the scars, not only on their bodies, but in the very essence of their humanity, corroded by the cold, the fear, and the inexorable march of history. Death in the frozen streets. The dawn that rose over Velikiye Luki in mid-December 1942 was not a benevolently golden sunrise, but a pale, diffuse light filtering through a veil of grey clouds, tinging the snow with a spectral hue, as if the sky were weeping ashes over a dying world. The city, once a peaceful crossroads of rural roads and railway lines in the Pskov region of vast western Russia, had transformed into a frozen hell, where the silence of the falling snow was broken only by the distant echoes of explosions and the muffled groans of the wounded. The Soviets, driven by the fury of Operation Mars, part of the winter offensive aimed at relieving pressure on Stalingrad to the south, were now advancing into the heart of the city, penetrating inner streets that seemed like the pulsating veins of a dying body. Each step forward was a plunge into a labyrinth of nightmares woven from shattered bricks, charred wood, and the icy vapor of human breath mingled with the stench of gunpowder and decay. The Germans, the remnants of the 83rd Infantry Division and auxiliary units, had transformed every remaining structure into an improvised fortress, born of pure desperation. A primary school, whose walls once echoed with the laughter of children learning the Cyrillic alphabet, now served as a deadly bunker. Wooden desks turned on their sides formed irregular barricades, behind which soldiers with sunken eyes and hollow faces gripped Kar-98K rifles, their fingers stiffened by the cold, barely able to pull the trigger without trembling. Children's desks, adorned with innocent scribbles, were piled like sandbags, and blackboards, cracked by shrapnel impacts, displayed hastily scribbled maps in charcoal, outlining defensive lines that shrank by the hour. A centuries-old Orthodox church, its bulbous dome now perforated like a sieve, housed snipers in the silent bell towers. The bells, which once summoned the faithful to morning prayers, now only tinkled when the vibrations of nearby shells made them dance like hanging ghosts. Underground cellars, where peasant families stored potatoes and cabbages to survive the harsh winters, had become damp, dark bunkers, filled with men huddled together like rats in a trap, the air thick with the smell of rancid sweat, frozen urine, and the constant whisper of prayers murmured in Bavarian or Prussian dialects. The Soviets, composed of regiments from the 381st Rifle Division and elements of the 3rd Shock Army, knew that a frontal advance would be collective suicide, an unnecessary carnage in narrow streets where German machine guns could mow down dozens in seconds. Instead, they adopted primitive and brutal infiltration tactics, crawling through the accumulated snow like snakes on ice, using bayonets to pierce wooden walls weakened by fire and Mosin-Nagant rifle butts to break down locked doors. They burst into dark rooms, where the combat became intimate and visceral, transcending firearms, knives plunged into throats with a wet gurgle, bayonets twisted into exposed entrails, clenched fists pounding skulls until the bone gave way with a nauseating crack, heavy boots crushing tracheas in a frenzied stampede, the hot steam from gasping mouths condensed in the frigid air, mingling with the acrid breath of primal terror, while blood gushed in crimson arcs across the virgin snow, freezing in grotesque patterns that resembled abstract paintings by a mad artist. And the snow. The merciless snow, that white blanket that fell incessantly from the sky like a cruel blessing mocking the agony below. It softened the contours of the ruins, transforming piles of rubble into gentle mounds, but betrayed the living with its treacherous smoothness. Soviet soldiers slipped on hidden ice floes, falling face down onto the rigid, frozen bodies of comrades fallen hours before, their faces colliding with glazed eyes that stared accusingly from beyond. Others, in an act of Desecration born of necessity used the dead as human shields, piling frost-hardened corpses to form makeshift barriers, something that would have horrified their souls in times of peace, but which in the vortex of Velikiye Luki became mere survival. A young Russian recruit, perhaps a 19-year-old farmer from a Ukrainian village devastated by Nazi occupation, crawled behind a fallen comrade, feeling the cold, inert weight against his chest, the smell of rigor mortis permeating his nostrils as he peered over the frozen shoulder. The Germans, abandoned to their fate after the failure of the 8th Panzer Division, fought with a ferocity born of a swan song, knowing that no reinforcements would come from the snowy horizon. No Opel Blitz truck would roar across the frozen roads with ammunition crates. No Luftwaffe would fly overhead to drop supplies by parachute. They fired with desperate precision, conserving each bullet as if it were the last drop of water in an Arctic desert. Their hands trembling not only from the cold that penetrated worn gloves, but from the terror that took root in their guts. When the shooting ceased for brief moments of forced truce, the air filled with the most terrifying sound, the dry crunch of Soviet boots in the compacted snow, approaching inexorably like the ticking of a clock counting the seconds to the slaughter. So, there was no choice but close-quarters combat. Men trapped in cramped rooms, shouting curses in hoarse German, thrusting bayonets with brute force, surviving for fractions of time that stretched into eternities of agony. The once insignificant Velikiye Luki, a mere footnote on military maps before the 1941 invasion, now stood as an inexorable factory of human suffering. Snow-covered sidewalks concealed pools of blood that seeped into the frozen ground like ruptured veins. Broken walls displayed impact craters, each narrating the fatal trajectory of a projectile that had claimed a life. Entire city blocks recounted personal tragedies. Here, a Russian mother, civilians caught in the crossfire, lay crushed under rubble with a child in her arms. There, a German soldier with a faded family photo in his pocket expired alone in an alley, his last breath forming a cloud that dissipated in the biting wind. In the midst of this chaos, an inescapable truth hung like acrid smoke in the icy air. No one fought like disciplined soldiers trained in military academies anymore. They had all regressed to a primal state, animals, trapped in a cage of ice and fire, driven only by the blind instinct to survive, scratching, biting, killing, to postpone the inevitable embrace of death for one more heartbeat. The siege closes like a fist. With each hard-won street, each wall brought down in a cacophony of crumbling bricks, and each German garrison eliminated in a frenzy of grenades and machine gun fire, the Soviets tightened their grip on the defenders like the inexorable fingers of a giant fist closing around a fragile throat, suffocating the remaining life with slow, relentless pressure. The city map, once an innocent tangle of cobblestone streets, wooden houses with sloping roofs, and the crucial railway lines linking Moscow to the Baltic, now transfigured into something sinister and prophetic, a concentric circle of fire, steel, and snow that contracted day by day like the pupils of a predator fixing on its agonizing prey without mercy or hesitation. From the outer perimeter, Soviet T-34 tanks, those mass-produced steel beasts from the Ural factories, with their rotating turrets and 76 mm guns that spat death with lethal precision, roared like awakened mythological beasts, pushing through mounds of accumulated snow before colliding with weakened walls, crushing makeshift shelters in a symphony of screeching metal and crumbling concrete. Inside the increasingly tight encirclement, the Germans had nowhere left to retreat. The defensive ghettos, meticulously prepared in the initial weeks of the siege with sandbags, barbed wire, and anti-tank mines, fell one by one like dominoes in a fatal game. Field hospitals, where exhausted surgeons operated by the light of flickering lanterns, were taken in nighttime assaults. leaving wounded men screaming for mercy as the Soviets dragged them out. Supply depots, piles of crates labeled with Nazi eagles, were set ablaze in flames that illuminated the night with an infernal orange glow. Administrative buildings, their neoclassical facades now riddled with holes, became mass graves where isolated groups of defenders were cornered and annihilated. Soviet artillery, positioned on wooded hills and clearings beyond the invisible siege lines, hammered the city with an almost ritualistic rhythm, like the beating of a merciless, mechanical heart. 152mm howitzers and Katyusha rocket launchers howled through the air, their projectiles crashing down with thuds that made the ground tremble as if the earth were convulsing in protest. The remaining houses vibrated and tilted dangerously, like structures intoxicated by chaos, each explosion sending shockwaves that cracked foundations and collapsed roofs, burying the living under tons of rubble. The tremor was so constant that many soldiers, both German and Soviet, no longer consciously perceived it. It had become the pulse of existence, a ceaseless reminder that there was no refuge, no corner untouched by the fury of war. As physical defenses withered like dry skin under the sun, German morale plummeted into an abyss of utter despair. One soldier received whispered news that his commander, a major decorated with the Iron Cross for actions at Smolensk, lay dead in a trench, his body half buried in the snow with a frozen expression of surprise. Another discovered at dawn that the unit's last medic, an elderly man recruited from the reserves, had succumbed to the cold during the night, his surgical instruments scattered around like useless relics. A third returned from a solitary patrol, only to find his entire platoon buried under an avalanche of charred bricks and beams, his comrades unrecognizable amidst the dust and ice. There was no longer any distinction between front and rear. The entire city was a single, suffocating battlefield, where the air thinned by cold and smoke made every breath a Herculean effort. The Soviets, now imbued with an unwavering confidence in the inevitability of victory, fueled by distant news of the surrender at Stalingrad that was beginning to spread like rumors, attacked with methodical and surgical precision, no longer like a furious, uncontrolled wave, but like master dissectors cutting through necrotic tissue. First, they isolated a block of houses with covering fire, surrounding the defenders in a ring of flames and bullets. Then they reduced them with grenades launched through shattered windows and bursts from PPSH-41 submachine guns, whose round drums spat out 900 rounds per minute in a deafening cacophony. Finally, they advanced to the next block, leaving behind a trail of contorted bodies and smoking buildings. It was a slow, deliberate advance, like the tightening of a tourniquet, each meter gained sealing the fate of the besieged. The entire city seemed to shrink around the Germans, as if the very streets contracted in solidarity with the siege. A German captain bent over a torn map on the floor of a damp basement, illuminated by a flickering candle, realized with a chill that the remaining grey territory, marked with smudged pencils representing controlled positions, now fit into a pathetic circle the size of his palm, while outside, thousands of Soviets, brutalized by the biting wind and the snow that whipped their faces, rustled their weapons in preparation for the final assault. Velikiye Luki was no longer just a besieged city, a strategic point on the map of the Eastern Front. It was a clenched fist of iron and ice, and within it, German bones creaked and cracked under the pressure, about to shatter into fragments of irremediable despair. When the ammunition runs dry and hope fades, at a certain point in the grim heart of January 1943, the war at Velikiye Luki transcended the realm of organized combat and degenerated into an inexorable countdown to oblivion, where the besieged Germans no longer deluded themselves with visions of victory or rescue, but merely calculated how many icy breaths remained before eternal silence. Ammunition, which at the beginning of the siege seemed as abundant as grain in an overflowing granary, Boxes of 7.92-meter cartridges stacked in underground depots was now rationed with obsessive parsimony, each bullet counted one by one like precious jewels in a depleted treasure. A cartridge passed from the worn pocket of one soldier to the trembling hand of another, as if it were a sacred relic, and many fired only when they saw the whites of enemy eyes, the terror reflected in them mirroring their own dread. Steel hand granite grenades once, launched lavishly, had become as rare as rays of sunshine in a Russian winter, reserved for moments of utter despair. Mortars lay silent not by tactic, but by an absolute scarcity of ammunition, their tubes cold and inert, like relics of a bygone era. Remaining Panzer IV tanks, paralyzed by lack of fuel and spare parts, were transformed into frozen sculptures in the streets, their immobile turrets serving as precarious observation posts, where starving crews stood guard with empty stares. The air radios, those vital links to the outside world, crackled with intermittent static, but no longer transmitted inspiring orders, promises of reinforcements, or messages of comfort from the Führer. Only silence, an echoing void that suggested that all of Germany, the entire Reich, had been swallowed by the Siberian abyss, leaving them adrift in an ocean of snow and isolation. Many soldiers began to believe, in hoarse whispers during the endless nights, that they were fighting not for Berlin, for Hitler, or for the Aryan honor proclaimed in fiery speeches, but merely for a few more minutes of existence, postponing the inevitable with tooth and nail. When weapons failed, barrels jammed by ice, mechanisms jammed by frost, the men resorted to what remained: bent and rusty bayonets, trench shovels used as makeshift axes, planks torn from broken doors, brandished as primitive clubs. In grotesque moments of close proximity, the fight became a shadowy brawl in dark basements, exhausted men striking each other inches apart, grunting like wounded beasts, sweat freezing on their foreheads as fingers dug into eyes or throats in a macabre dance of tactile violence. On the Soviet side, fatigue also settled in like a heavy fog, but it was mitigated by constant replenishment. New regiments arrived from the reserves, bringing fresh ammunition and faces hardened by Stalinist propaganda, fueled by the certainty that victory was merely a matter of persistence. They advanced with a grim confidence, whispering amongst themselves in harsh Russian dialects, "They're already dead, they just haven't fallen yet," while they watched the Germans cower in smoldering ruins, counting cartridges like beggars counting coins. For the besieged, winter imposed an additional torment, invisible and insidious: hunger, a silent killer that reaped as much as bullets. Rations had run out weeks before, reduced to crumbs of rock-hard bread and watery soup made of melted snow and dried herbs. Hungry, men jumped over empty cans, scraping charred remains with dirty fingernails, chewing on boot leather softened by the fire to trick their empty stomachs, any fiber that provided an illusion of sustenance to survive another shift of vigil. The weakest succumbed to delirium, fainting in uncontrollable tremors, their skeletal bodies trembling in the cold that penetrated to the marrow. Many simply did not wake at dawn, their hearts stopping in the silence of the night, transforming into ice statues that comrades dragged out like inert burdens. Winter, hunger, siege, all were invisible allies of the Red Army, fighting without raising a rifle, eroding the will to live drop by drop. When a German unit spent its last magazine of ammunition, the officer, with eyes bloodshot with exhaustion, hung a torn white cloth not as a sign of formal surrender, but as a grim warning of the final battle. Bayonets against bayonets, men against inexorable fate, in a final dance of death where the victor was. Always oblivion, hope, that ethereal flame that had once illuminated hearts with visions of glory, now lay clearly like an ember slowly dying in the icy wind, its ashes scattered across the merciless snow. Each distant artillery blast sounded like a gravedigger's hammer, hammering the final nail into the German garrison's coffin, echoing the inescapable verdict. By this point, The question hanging in the frozen air was no longer whether Velikiye Luki would fall, for its fall was as certain as the sunrise, but only when its last defender, a broken spectre of a man, would finally be buried beneath layers of snow and eternal silence, leaving behind only echoes of terror and despair that would haunt history for generations. The last message, the last breath. When the German garrison realized that the siege wouldn't budge an inch, neither to tighten nor loosen, only one final gesture remained, a distress call that deep down, everyone knew would never be answered. The radio, already weak, with dying batteries and makeshift antennas made from burnt beams, began to crackle again. The operator, a young former mathematics teacher from Bavaria, shivered with cold as he turned the knobs with hardened, cracked fingers. He conveyed one last desperate message. "We are surrounded. No food, no ammunition. Many were wounded. Critical situation. We need immediate support, or we will be destroyed." On the other end, there was silence, then a hissing sound, then nothing. The operator tried to repeat the conversation. His voice failed, his throat burned dry. Finally, struck by bitter certainty, he slowly switched off the radio, like closing the eyes of a dead friend. And then the small group of officers gathered around him understood. No one was coming. No one was in their way. They were alone, abandoned at the end of the line, condemned to their own fate in the Russian winter. This final message spread through the rest of the troop like an icy whisper. It wasn't shouted from the rooftops, it was felt. Soldiers perceived it in their commanders' eyes, in the weary tone of the orders, in the absence of gunfire from reinforcements. And the reaction wasn't unanimous. Some screamed furiously against their fate, tearing off their helmets and cursing the white sky. Others silently cleaned their weapons one last time, knowing this was the end. Some finally let tears freeze on their faces because hiding the pain no longer mattered. From the beginning of that cursed siege, soldiers had been falling silently, but now each life became a flickering candle about to go out. The general staff inside the city discussed possibilities, a final assault, a suicidal breakaway, or a bitter and humiliating surrender. But even these options seemed like fantasies. The city was so destroyed that going out in any direction was like walking through an open field of death. Even so, in that crushed stronghold, something dignified and tragic happened, even without hope. Even knowing that no one would save them, many soldiers decided to fight until the last warm breath of life escaped their frozen lungs. It was an almost irrational gesture, not for Berlin, not for honor, but because abandoning the fight meant admitting that they had come there only to die. And then began what would be the garrison's last full day. The Soviets attacked knowing it was the end. There was no more elaborate strategy, only circles of death closing in on an enemy that was barely breathing. The Germans, even exhausted, still created pockets of fierce resistance in basements, in piles of bricks, behind derailed wagons. But each shot seemed to echo fainter than the last. Each grenade thrown, each bayonet raised, seemed to exact the price of a soul. The entire city, covered in snow and surrounded by the distant roar of artillery, seemed to silently observe the fate of the last men who continued fighting in its name. Velikiye Luki, once a point on the map, was now a white altar waiting to receive the final sacrifices. And when the grey sun hid behind even heavier clouds, the defenders realized this was the garrison's penultimate collective gasp. The last would come with the dawn, and with it, death or surrender. End of the fortress, end of men. The last morning in Velikiye Luki dawned without sun. The sky was a thick fabric of grey clouds, so heavy they seemed almost to touch the broken rooftops. A strange and absolute silence hung over the ruins. There were no more explosions in the distance. No more stray gunshots. Only the icy wind, whistling between broken windows and burnt beams, as if the city itself were breathing for the last time. When the Soviets launched their final assault, they didn't find a wall of fire waiting for them. They found black ruins and exhausted men clutching empty rifles. The last German lines were no longer lines. They were makeshift patches of resistance made of pure instinct. Some soldiers still had bayonets fixed and teeth clenched. Others could barely stand. The Russians advanced like a silent sea, going from door to door, from rubble to rubble. In many places there was no fighting. They found soldiers sitting, motionless as statues, their gaze lost in nothingness, so beyond pain that they had ceased to feel cold, hunger, or fear. These were taken as prisoners, their trembling hands raised not as a conscious surrender, but as a natural surrender of the body. Elsewhere, there was ultimate hell. Men who had sworn to fight to the last drop of blood did so with an almost animalistic fervor. Improvised grenades exploded inside destroyed houses, bodies were hurled against cracked walls, and bayonets found flesh more times than anyone would care to remember. They were short, convulsive, and desperate battles, agony squeezed into minutes, and then, like a sigh, it was over. By noon, the Soviets had taken the city center. The last surviving defenders were surrounded inside a partially destroyed factory. They held out until the last rifle fired its last bullet. When all was silent, the Soviets entered and found only a few men standing, hands raised, eyes empty, surrounded by mutilated or frozen comrades. There was no victory there, just survival. Velikiye Luki, once just a minor point on a forgotten railway, now lay like an open scar on the war map. Every street was a ditch, every cellar an improvised tomb. Thousands died to conquer and defend that small railway junction, and in the end, the prize that remained was snow-stained. Red in a city so destroyed it could barely be recognized. The Soviets hoisted the red flag among broken stones, and the wind made it crackle cold and loud, as if the earth itself were recording the end of that massacre. For the Russians, it was a strategic and moral victory. For the Germans, it was yet another reminder of the terrible price of the war in the East. And for humanity, Velikiye Luki would become a grim warning that even the smallest piece of land can turn into hell, that no map shows how much blood each line cost, and that cold fear and steel can transform ordinary men into beasts or ghosts frozen in the eternal silence of the snow. In the end, the city's name became etched not in memory for its greatness, but for its sacrifice. Velikiye Luki, the small fortress that fought until its last breath. Siberian snow, urban carnage, no escape. In the final analysis, Velikiye Luki proves a brutal truth about World War II. Sometimes the smallest places tell the biggest stories. A city that many in the world couldn't even point out on a map became an abyss where the fate of hundreds of men sank, and where winter, hunger, and fire competed to see which of them was the most efficient executioner. When the last guns fell silent, and the snow was finally allowed to fall, without being torn apart by bullets or explosions, what remained was not victory or defeat in the usual sense. What remained was a sacred space, a field of silence laden with ghosts. Every smoking brick, every twisted rail, and every frozen meter of that city became a silent witness to a profound truth. War makes no distinction between size, importance, or glory. She just consumes. Velikiye Luki did not produce inflammatory speeches. It didn't make headlines like Stalingrad or Kursk. But there, German and Soviet soldiers discovered something they would never forget. Those who returned alive to remember that human beings can endure far beyond what logic allows. But it can also fall apart. Too quickly, when hope, warmth, and companionship disappear. The battle revealed a German empire crumbling into fragments, not only in the twisted metal of abandoned tanks, but in the morale of soldiers who realized that Berlin was too far away and Moscow even further unreachable. It showed the Red Army transforming suffering into strength and learning in practice how relentless sieges would prevail on the Eastern Front from then on. And above all, it revealed the true king of that theater of war, the Russian winter, indifferent, impassive, inevitably fatal. When historians analyze maps and reports, it's easy to imagine only troop movements, divisions and numbers. But Velikiye Luki forces us to confront the flesh behind the graphics. Men freezing in the darkness, sharing their last cigarette, writing their last letter, promising themselves they would see the sun rise again. For many, that sun never came. In the end, Velikiye Luki was taken house by house, room by room, stone by stone. But this Soviet victory, won with discipline and bloodshed, did not erase the suffering that preceded it, not even the names of those who did not return. The city would rebuild its walls, but it would never rebuild the lives that were lost. And today, when the wind blows through the trees that have grown over the ruins, perhaps it carries memories that only he can hear. The muffled sob of a soldier too cold to cry, the muffled cry of a night attack, the final whisper of a radio that no one answered. Velikiye Luki taught the world that no wall is invincible, but no human spirit is easily broken. What small pieces of land can bear the weight of empires? And war, cruel and blind, devours everything until nothing remains but snow-stained red and eternal silence. This was the story of an icy fortress that did not give up easily, and of men who fought until they no longer had the strength even to fall. Siberian snow, urban carnage, no escape.